Pixar's Up is, as of today, 15 years old. And honestly, I kind of think this movie fits being 15 years old. I could see the idea that this movie's been 15 years old for the past 6 years now. This movie, if you were to list it against all of the other Pixar filmography, great masterpieces, classical and terrible, that's the full scale of Pixar movies as far as I'm concerned. This movie, I think, sorely lands as central as you can get. Because when you go and tell someone, what do you think about Disney Pixar's Up? They will all say, it's so heart-wrenching, it's so adorable. I love and I'm despairing the first 5 to 10 minutes of the film. And I don't think anyone can really deny this whole mini sequence in animated form is possibly one of the greatest short movies, if you were to just cut it out, of all time in the animation industry. I don't think it won any awards, but it struck to the core of millions and millions of people, and you can really tell that it did something because it became a TikTok sound at one point, and so you know it's part of the pop culture zeitgeist there. However, 15 years later, I kind of want to ask a question, right? How many times have you watched Pixar's Up? And how far did you watch it? Did you watch it all the way start to finish? Because this whole movie is a lot more than just the Carl backstory, and I think a lot of people overlook it. I believe I watched this movie once in the cinemas. I'm sure I was devastated in the first 10 minutes. I remember it, without having to be reminded. But then the rest of the movie just happened, you know? You could say that there are some great iconic moments, like the bits that are in all of the trailers. Doug shouting out squirrel, that is a joke. Kevin being Kevin, of course. And actually, upon revisiting this movie, yeah, it's actually a lot of fun. I really like the villain. I'm less of a fan of the dog that can speak, but happens to have a very high-pitched voice. It's not quite my style of humor, personally. I think it's a little bit easy. I want to say done, but this movie came out in 2009, so maybe that's not quite fitting. But the actual final element of, the giant blimp, and thematically how Carl is, the opposite version of the villain, going down a different path, all very brilliant. However, I also think this movie is awfully forgettable, because as much as I adore the final act with the big blimp sequence that I'm sure justified the whole rest of this movie getting made, and the general population is a great massive fan of the first 8 minutes of the movie, there's then still that whole 2/3 chunk in the middle, which is just kind of alright. I'm not going to say that it's terrible, because it's a great relationship between, of course, Carl and the boy. There's also that whole element of him literally having to let go of his house and sacrificing it in order to succeed in the final moments. All great stuff. But this movie, I think, is a quiet little tragedy, because as much as I don't particularly enjoy it, I've always got my maybe more basic opinions of fanboying over The Incredibles, and maybe slightly off kilter with Coco being my next favorite. But this is the Pixar movie that had not so much the least impact, because it's clearly there in the pop culture zeitgeist, but it's just not talked about as much as all of the others. Thematically, it's pretty decent. The animation is great as well. And I said earlier it didn't win any awards. It did win all sorts of awards as a main full-length feature, being nominated for Best Picture, again, not really seen in the animation field before, Best Original Screenplay, Best Sound Editing, and then won Best Animated Feature and Best Original Score. But again, this could very well just be because it's Pixar, you know, kind of attached to Big Daddy Studio Disney. And of course, they were showered in awards from other places as well, the Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, Annie Awards. But considering we're now here 15 years later, it's interesting to see where this franchise did and didn't go, you know? A movie coming out and just being fine and normal is okay. They don't all have to be absolute masterclasses in storytelling. It's a big shoe to fill just to release anything as a studio as notorious as Pixar. Although as much as I say it wasn't a success, it made $735 million. And over $500 million of that is in actual profits. Even still, clearly, it's no Toy Story, it's no Cars, it's no Inside Out. It's not massively known. It's not a massive IP that keeps selling stuff now. As much as I'm sure you'll find all sorts of merch at Disney World or something. Still, what is interesting is what they have done with the franchise since then, as there have been, ironically enough, some short films produced. Hey there! You're now halfway through this video, probably a short one this time, so this is a very speedy poke to tell you to subscribe and let us know your thoughts on Pixar's Up. Have you watched it recently? Have you not? I'd be really curious if you haven't and if you're not a big fan of this movie because it's just not that impactful. I'd love to hear your reasonings for why it didn't impact you or why you think it might not be as massive as other projects by Pixar. Do keep the discussion going wherever you feel, but otherwise I'll let you get back to the rest of the slightly negative anniversary of Pixar's Up 50th year anniversary. Still, what is interesting is what they have done with the franchise since then, as there have been, ironically enough, some short films produced, 2 being made in 2009. You've got Doug's Special Mission, a short about what Doug was doing before meeting with Carl and the boy, and then you've got George and AJ, which was a 2D little short about the 2 guys that go to visit Carl's house, and their reaction to it flying away. And then very recently, in 2023, we had Carl's Date. Releasing alongside Pixar's Elemental, it's the finale for the Doug Days Disney Plus series, which they also made, focusing on him preparing for his first date since Ellie's death. Which is, wow, very heartful. And on the one hand, it's nice that 15 years later, or I guess 14 years later, they finally sort of come to a conclusion for the series. The series, of course, can't really go any further than that. It's already an old man in the final stages of his life, trying to live a life not of regrets at the end. Plus, the topic matter itself, isn't that crazy other than housefly. It's great for set design, that's about it, But beyond all of that, even after standing here 15 years later with the prompt of, here, let's talk about Pixar's Up for once, and I'm now coming here with very little left to say, because there isn't too much to say about this movie. I'm sure if I really did a deep dive into it, I could dig into some great subtext that makes this the underrated classic Pixar that you never really knew or understood. I can see the clickbait already, but so far, that's just fan fiction in my head. Because this movie really is just exactly what it is on the tin. Sure, it won loads of awards, but it was produced by Pixar. Yes, the animation is brilliant. Wow, they animated a lot of balloons. That takes a lot of technological prowess. Again, because it's attached to Pixar. And while I'm sure there were some kids that were head over heels, head in the clouds style, obsessed with Pixar's Up, I don't think it quite captured that same eclectic energy that maybe the Monsters, Inc. universe brings, because it introduces one weird alien bird and then dog. And I don't think a single normal-ish dog, just one that can talk, really pushes enough for that creativity that Pixar was past known for. Great for the emotion. I don't need to remind you about the first 6 minutes, but a lot of the rest of it is just okay. Now, if you haven't watched this movie recently, I'm going to suggest you give it a watch, because it, of course, is only 15 years old, and maybe now with a more adult mindset, you might enjoy something differently than you did before. Charles Muntz as the villain is still awfully unhinged in his way of wanting to kill other humans that are searching for a potentially almost extinct bird. But talking about the sort of elements of regretful life and being an old man for 2 of these characters could be an interesting theme you can read into by seeing it yourself. I mean, it's certainly something Pixar's been more open to talk about later on in life, with obviously the Cars 3 movie all about Lightning McQueen's retirement. But yeah, with a super quick 96-minute runtime, it just came out in 2009, had an impact in some form, and the rest it didn't. By no means is it a flop or failure by Pixar, it's just the most mid movie you could make. Underrated in little pockets, enjoyable if you watched it again, but otherwise, maybe it's the most tragic Pixar movie. It's not as explosively bad as The Good Dinosaur, or sparking a debate a la Turning Red. It's just a movie, buried under the attention span of a fast-moving world going at a pace that an old man like Carl can't keep up with. Buried in its own mediocrity. I love it way more than a bunch of other mid-movies, but it just isn't popular based on its design. This will probably be the most pessimistic anniversary episode we've ever done, but it's worth talking about anyway. And since I've run out of other talking points to talk about this movie, it's so unimpactful, I'm now gonna end it off there. My apologies, I feel like I've done a flop job, but unless I ramble to you about production details, there's just not that much to say at the minute. Maybe I'll do a super analytical deep dive and then I'll find something that really brings up this movie. Until then, I'm gonna end it off here. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this more scattered ramble than normal. Do let me know your thoughts about Pixar's Up. I'll be really curious to hear if there is a secret rabid fandom for this movie, or whether the very fact that you haven't watched this movie in years brings up some thoughts of your own regarding this movie. Why do you think that is, and why doesn't it impact you, for example? I would love to hear your thoughts down on the YouTube comments or on our Discord server, linked in the description. And finally, I shall see you in a little bit.